Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Meyer, and I am a member of the HEAL Data Stewardship Group. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this installment of our Fresh Fair webinar series titled Planning for Data Deposition, Best Practices and Key Resources for Researchers. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all registrants. If at any point you have a question, please feel free to type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will bring it up during the question and answer session after our presentations. Today's session emphasizes why proactive planning for data sharing throughout the research data lifecycle is so important, not only to reduce burden at the time of submission, but also to ensure that data sets remain valuable and reusable in the long term. We will share lessons learned from HEAL Stewards' work with investigators, as well as from HEAL-funded clinical trials, highlighting both challenges and successful strategies. You will also learn about supporting resources and tools that can help integrate data sharing practices across the lifecycle, and we will conclude with a Q&A session with our presenters. Today's presenters are Ali Gartland-Gray. She is a data strategist at RTI International. She specializes in ensuring data that is properly managed, shared, and utilized to drive meaningful insights and discoveries according to the FAIR principles. Her educational background is in biology and biomedical health and informatics, and she leverages this knowledge as a HEAL steward to help develop tools and guidance for research data governance, curation, and deposition. Dr. Keith Marsolo is a professor in the Department of Population Health Sciences and a member of the Duke Clinical Research Institute. His current research focuses on infrastructure to support the use of electronic health records, or EHRs, and other real-world data sources in observational and comparative effectiveness research and in public health surveillance, as well as standards and architectures for multi-center learning health systems. He is the co-principal investigator in the Coordinating Center of the NIH Pragmatic Clinical Trials Collaboratory, as well as the lead of the Electronic Health Records Core. Dr. Marsolo received his PhD in computer science from The Ohio State University with dissertation on data mining, specifically the modeling and classification of biomedical data. At this time, I will turn the presentation over to Ali Gartland-Gray.
Thanks, Sarah. Next slide, please. Okay, so today we are going to be debuting a new resource that's on the healdatafair.org website called Data Sharing Throughout the Research Lifecycle. And the goal of this resource is to help researchers do the things that they're already doing in the normal course of their research, but tweaking it a little bit to make data sharing easier when data sharing rolls around. So the resource covers the what, when, why, and how of common data sharing and reuse challenges that we've seen as HEAL stewards across the HEAL data ecosystem, and what researchers can do to overcome them. And I just also quickly want to note that we're not adding a bunch of new to-do items that you weren't doing before, but instead this resource is meant to help researchers work a little bit smarter to make life easier down the road when everyone's trying to meet their HEAL expectations and share fair data. And by fair data, of course, I mean findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Next slide, please. So what is successful data sharing? Well, in the eyes of the HEAL data ecosystem, it's three pieces essentially. So one, of course, is that HEAL expectations are satisfied. The next is that the data that are shared by researchers is as fair as possible. And then the final is that it was a positive data sharing experience overall. And if you'll click one more time, Sarah. So this resource addresses that point 3 because it walks through what you and your team can do at each stage of the research lifecycle to set yourselves up for a positive data sharing experience when the time comes. And we're totally aware that most researchers don't say like, oh, that was really smooth and really easy the first time that they share data. But our hope is that this resource will help to decrease frustration, confusion, and hopefully result in fewer late-stage surprises. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the research lifecycle, data sharing is usually described as its own stage, and it's usually one of the end stages, and that's just a little bit misleading because it suggests that the end of the research project is when we should really start considering data sharing in earnest, but it doesn't really show how data sharing activities are influenced by what was done in earlier stages. So instead, let's think about how things we do earlier in the life cycle strongly influence how easy or how difficult it will be to share data when the time comes. And that data sharing really starts with data management and project management right at the beginning of the project. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of benefits to paying attention to data sharing throughout the whole research life cycle. And we've listed a few of them here on the slides, which include avoiding really common pitfalls, hopefully reducing confusion and frustration, preventing late-stage surprises or changes, and then, of course, operating more effectively as a research team, sharing data that is more fair, and hopefully increasing confidence in data sharing. Next slide, please. So this brand new resource, which I've put up on the left of the slide, a screenshot of it, is really complementary to the HEAL checklist that we all know and love. And Lizelle is going to drop some links to both of these resources in the chat here. And if you're not familiar with the HEAL checklist, essentially it just outlines the steps that HEAL researchers need to take to be HEAL compliant throughout the life of your award. And then the data sharing throughout the research lifecycle resource helps set researchers up for success in completing those steps by encouraging proactive planning to reduce the burden at the time of data submission, sharing lessons learned from our work as HEAL stewards with investigators, and looking at the data lifecycle through the lens of planning for eventual data deposition. Next slide, please. So what can the resource tell you? Well, it will outline the steps that researchers need to take to successfully share data. It'll guide you on when to take each of those steps, why data sharing is important, and how each of those steps will impact data sharing. And then there are also additional resources to help provide more context. Next slide, please. And then what topics are covered. So we go over real data sharing and reuse challenges that we have directly seen in the HEAL data ecosystem. We talk about how these challenges arise and tips on how to either prevent them in the first place or resolve them when they do arise. And we also answer a lot of really frequently asked questions that we hear when we're working directly with HEAL researchers. And like I mentioned, we link out to resources created by us as the HEAL stewards and also other people who are experts in these topics. And now what isn't going to be really covered by this resource is like highly context-specific challenges that individuals sometimes face or super detailed action steps to take. Next slide, please. So who should use it? In short, everyone who is involved in the research data lifecycle could hopefully benefit from this resource in one way or another. So that includes principal investigators, statisticians, data managers, study coordinators, etc. Next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to walk you through just a couple of examples that I want to call out from the resource. So you can feel free to follow along via the link that was sent in the chat a couple slides back, or just keep these slides up and I'll walk through them via screenshots. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to quickly get us oriented, so we can see on the left-hand side there is a list of the different stages of the research life cycle. At the top, there's a brief overview, and then in the meat of the page right there in the middle is the steps that each stage has. So each stage has multiple steps, and you can expand and collapse those steps with the buttons on the middle right of the page there. And then if we click, for example, on the writing an NIH data management and sharing plan stage, next slide, please. So we'll see information about writing a data management and sharing plan. And the information for all of these steps is sort of organized the same way. So up top, you see sort of a brief description, an overview of what the step entails. The next section is the lessons learned. So that is information that we as stewards have learned from either our own research sometimes, but mostly from working with HEAL investigators directly. Next is what to do at this step of the research data life cycle. And then finally, the last section is links out to additional resources and guidance. So in skimming this, you'll notice that it's not a step-by-step guide for writing a data management and sharing plan, but instead it really calls out key actions and considerations that will hopefully make life easier down the road. So, for example, aligning your data management and sharing plan with NIH and HEAL specific requirements, such as selecting a HEAL compliant repository or using HEAL common data elements, will help make implementing your data management and sharing plan that much easier, and hopefully will also result in fewer changes to the plan as you're implementing it. And then down in that additional resources section, there is where you would find more in-depth guidance on actually writing your data management and sharing plan, reviewing the HEAL data sharing requirements, etc. Next slide, please. So another example is in the generate and collect stage of the life cycle, and that is using common data elements. So some studies are required to use HEAL CDEs, and for everyone else, even if it's not required, it's encouraged to use HEAL CDEs when applicable. So hopefully this would have been something that you thought about when you were writing your data management and sharing plan, so that by the time you're ready to start data collection, your instruments are ready and you're good to go. And if you fail to use CDEs when you should have, you might end up spending a lot more time preparing your data than you bargained for before you can share it. Next slide, please. So the final example is in the share step, and it's choosing a data repository. And once again, hopefully this is something that you thought about when you were writing your data management and sharing plan, and you selected a repository sort of right at the beginning. And not only if you selected a repository, hopefully that also means that you have an idea of the requirements that that data repository might have. So hopefully when you were considering which to choose, that's something that you considered, because some repositories might have requirements or restrictions related to the data types that they accept, file size or file format restrictions, de-identification requirements for anyone who's conducting human subjects research, and of course cost. So selecting a repository early on in the process and having an understanding of what the requirements of that repository are will help ensure that there are no surprises when it comes time to actually share data in that repository. Next slide, please. Okay, so that is it for me. I just lastly want to reiterate that this is a living resource, so we definitely want to hear feedback from you all once you've had time to click through it. We're happy to hear your thoughts. So you can provide feedback either via joining the HEAL Slack if you're already on there. You can shoot any of the HEAL Stewards at Slack, or you can use the Connect with Us form, which is linked here on the slide. And with that, I will hand things over to Keith.
Great, thanks, Ali. So if we go to the next slide. So now I'm going to provide some perspectives from the NIH Pragmatic Trials Collaboratory Coordinating Center. So if we go to the next slide. Just a little bit about the collaboratory, because I think we're somewhat unique in the sense that we're not a specific trial, but a sort of a more of an organizing body that coordinates amongst trials. So it's been in existence for over 10 years now, initiated via the Common Fund, and then it's been transitioned to funding from multiple institutes and centers along with the HEAL initiative. So we do have a number of HEAL specific trials that I'll get into in a second. The goal is really to strengthen the capacity to implement large-scale, pragmatic clinical trials, and then just supporting those trials by establishing best practices and disseminating knowledge. And so those are really our sort of two main goals of the collaboratory coordinating center. So if we go to the next slide. So just in terms of the structure, again, in terms of the funding, it's funded by the individual NIH institutes and centers along with the HEAL initiative. That goes to the coordinating center, which has a number of core working groups. The electronic health records core that I lead is one of those cores, and then funding also goes to the trials, and then there's sort of steering committee, and then we have membership from NIH as well. So we go to the next slide. So the coordinating center, again, it's sort of national leadership and technical expertise, really around producing, documenting, and disseminating standards, supporting synergies across trials and across the program, and coordinating on communication. So we go to the next slide. One of our sort of major pieces of dissemination, if you will, is the living textbook of pragmatic clinical trials. And so you can, the link rethinkingclinicaltrials.org. A lot of information on the collaboratory program, and then a number of chapters that are continuously updated and expanding with sort of internal and external contributors. So if we go to the next slide. Just in terms of the topics, you can see them here. Sort of 30 chapters, over 100,000 visitors a year. We have information on sort of the design of trials, data, tools, and conduct, dissemination and implementation, and then ethics and regulatory. And I will say that we've been trying to build out some of the material that we have related to data sharing, often linking out to the HEAL material that Ali, the types of things that Ali just covered in her presentation. So there's a lot of information out there that's sort of useful for folks that are thinking of trials in this manner. So we'll go to the next slide. So in terms of the actual trials themselves, so the collaboratory in its sort of period of existence supported 35 trials, over 1,400 clinical sites, over 1 million patients, 49 states in Puerto Rico. We have not yet had a trial that included sites from Arkansas, but I'm hopeful that will be we'll get there at some point here in the near future. Go to the next slide. These are the sort of the list, the acronyms of all the different trials that are out there. The ones that are HEAL specific are sort of highlighted in red. And most of them sort of follow the sort of UH3, UG3, where there's a planning and startup phase, followed by it's typically 12 months, and then followed by the implementation phase. And so a number of our HEAL trials, I think, are finishing up sort of the data collection. I think some of them are now in the analysis, and then we've got others that are I think a few that were just sort of announced in the last couple of weeks that are actually not on this slide yet, and so it continues to expand over time. So if we go to the next slide. So now I'll talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned that have been reported by the HEAL trials, because again, the collaboratory itself doesn't collect data. It coordinates, but we do facilitate the conversations amongst the HEAL trials around sort of data sharing and other things. And this has been an active area of conversation within the collaboratory. So Um, there was a lot of initial conversations amongst the trials around like what are the repositories that were going to be used, and I will get into some examples of sort of why certain ones were selected. But what you can see is that it's roughly split 50-50 between the ICPSR and then the NIMH data archive, and so that's been I think roughly where our HEAL trials have landed, because many of them have sort of human subjects involved in other things, and so there are some restrictions that need to be taken into consideration. So we go to the next slide. So a few of the kind of additional caveats as I get into maybe some of the lessons in things. So several trials were funded sort of before the revised data sharing requirements into effect, and so unlike projects that happen now, where you have to have a lot of this sort of fleshed out, or at least have a plan fleshed out at the time of submission, these data sharing plans were done sort of after the fact, and so the decisions might have been slightly different if they had to think about it ahead of time. Collaboratory studies have a mix of consent processes, and so some trials obtain individual patient consent, others rely on sort of waivers of consent, and they just use data collected through the course of clinical care, and so there is no patient consent that is obtained. And then the other thing sort of related to that, depending on what's in consent forms and then what's in the data sharing agreements with the institutions that are providing data, the health systems or clinics, um, uh, sometimes the language that's in there, the data can potentially identify sites or clinics or providers. And so if there's sort of expectations around confidentiality or other things, sort of privacy, anonymity, that can have ramifications on what could be shared. If there's a variable that can kind of uniquely identify a clinic provider, for instance, and there's restrictions on it in a data sharing agreement on sort of re-identification, that may influence something that could be contributed to a data repository down the road. So if we go to the next slide. So just thought, sort of walking through kind of three of the areas that have sort of areas of discussion that we've had amongst the trial. So the first is around repository selection. So I said, there were sort of 50-50 in terms of the selections. Cost, I think Ali mentioned this, sort of the cost was a factor of some of the early trials because again, they didn't have sort of funding specifically allocated for this. There's been some questions around sharing pilot data, where to store that. Like, does that go in the same repository as the sort of final analytic data set, or again, because of cost decisions, do you put it somewhere else? Sort of where to store it, and then how much time to invest. If it's just pilot data, not really used in the analysis, sort of lower value. It's not necessarily the best use of everyone's time to worry about that. But again, if there's requirements that it be shared, that's something that the projects have had to take into consideration. And then a big one has been around aligning sort of the repository access policies with the language in the consents. And so this came up around I think, consent language around, sort of to a participant signing a consent form that says like, I agree that my data may be used for nonprofit research purposes, which is very different than, if it's a public access sort of repository where there really aren't as many restrictions on how those data could be reused in terms of like, is it for commercial purposes or, sort of for-profit companies or other things, right? So making sure that you're sort of you're in compliant with sort of the repository requirements as well as the requirements of the consent forms. And then the other thing that has come up around amongst the projects, again, because they're all sort of multi-center, is consent forms that have kind of inconsistent language across sites. And so again, making sure that you don't have terms that were inadvertently inserted into a consent form that might prevent sort of the full data set being shared in a given repository or causing you to look in a look for a different repository, for instance, because you can't share sort of all of the data, in a single one because of a certain restriction. So those were some big factors I think that were driving the decision process from some of our studies. Next slide. So another one, and Ali touched on this in her part of the conversation, sort of around like kind of data mapping and variable mapping, common data elements and things. So this process for mapping variables, converting variables into the formats required by the repository, it can be time consuming. So like for example, de-identifying dates. And so we've had projects that have, they sort of use the full date. They may use the full date as a limited data set in their analysis, but then when it comes time for sort of de-identification, they may have sort of a process in place to share using the safe harbor method. And so under HIPAA, safe harbor basically says that you're going to share the year only. There's also like the expert determination method that goes through the statistical de-identification process, but that's a little bit more involved. And so if a project opts for safe harbor and can only share the year, then you need to kind of map, sort of the month and year of a variable to something. And so, you've got to create a process to map everything to January 1. And then verify that that's actually being applied to all dates in your project. And so those are the kinds of things that studies have need to work through. And then the other thing that is sort of a factor that can sometimes impact the reusability of the data. The repository naming conventions, because the study was using sort of their own internal naming conventions, renaming everything for the repository meant that the existing analytic code was not as useful, not as reusable without modification, because again, you're referencing sort of variables that don't exist in the data that were uploaded in the repository. And so those another example of an issue that the projects are sort of having to work through. And then if we go to the next slide, and then finally, just around the common data elements. And so the collaboratory studies, it's a mix of data sources. So there may be case report forms, extracts from electronic health records, from claims. Those are sometimes private claims, sometimes CMS claims. The data don't typically originate as CDEs, and so you've got a map, and so then sometimes that can require result in data loss. And so an example that came up just a few weeks ago that we were discussing was around sort of morphine milligram equivalent, and so project was instructed to exclude buprenorphine because the focus was on pain management, not on opioid use disorder. But for this particular trial, they had a number of patients who were receiving that medication, and so when they calculated the CDE, it was a result of sort of drop patients, drop data. And so, this is one of those examples where there may not be a right answer. I think depending on what you're trying to optimize or the in some sense the problem you're trying to solve. And so, but these are still kind of decisions that the trials would need to make in terms of how they're sort of mapping things. And so just working through those different trade-offs and understanding things is important. And then I think if we go to the next slide, I think this is my last slide. So the one thing or the couple of takeaways that I would leave you all with is, the studies really report that the HEAL resources have been helpful in their planning and in their decision making. Certainly, I can echo the push to start this process early. The earlier, the better, because you don't want to get too far and then have to, sort of redo things, or you sort of have wasted effort or wasted work. Take advantage of the videos, webinars, sort of, reach out to the various resources that are out there that are there to help and can really be useful in trying to navigate this process. And so I think with that, I can turn it back over to Sarah.
Thank you, Keith. And Ali for those presentations. As you've noted, our presenters have highlighted two resources: data sharing throughout the research lifecycle and the living textbook of pragmatic trials. we wanted to highlight a few other resources that are helpful for other data types. If you have social science data or data in the opioid use area, you may find the ICPSR Social Science Research Guide in its 6th edition as extremely helpful for identifying data types, and data curation expectations. In addition, the Qualitative Data Repository has excellent resources if you have any mixed methods or qualitative data that you are working with. And finally, whether you are in an institution or an organization or an agency, you may have library resources that are available. They may be in your general library. If there's a medical library, those are also often extremely useful and available. The types of people you may be speaking to are data librarians, data stewards, or someone in your research and data management core. People in these areas and these departments often put out extremely valuable and detailed resources that are specific to your institution or agency. As you've heard today, proactive planning for data packaging helps reduce the burden at submission and makes future data sharing and reuse much easier. Thoughtful planning also supports compliance and ensures that your data can have a lasting impact beyond the life of your project. There are a variety of tools and resources available to help your team prepare, package, and share data effectively. And most importantly, please do not wait until the last minute. Please reach out to HEAL Stewards for consultations or other experts that you have, and tailored guidance will be provided, and please get started early. Now, at this point, we are going to move on to the Q&A session. So if everyone can please turn on their cameras, I'm going to stop the screen sharing and we will begin. All right, so question number 1, we will start with Ali. Can you walk us through a typical timeline between submitting data to a repository and when it becomes accessible to other researchers?
Yeah, so I have sort of an unsatisfying answer to that question, which is it totally depends. So it depends on a couple of different factors, one of which is which repository that you intend to use. So if you're using a generalist repository or any other repository that doesn't offer any type of like curation support or assistance, then it will be immediate pending you don't put your data under an embargo. So like Figshare, for example, there are options where you can just upload the data and publish them right away, and they're available immediately because there's no sort of like human curation at Figshare that will assist with reviewing that. For some of the other repositories that do offer really like awesome hands-on support and assistance, like ICPSR, for example, it could take a couple months because it really depends on the quality of the data that you're submitting, because there's a human curator who will go through and review your data to make sure it's sufficiently de-identified, you're not missing any variables, etc. So depending on how much back and forth there is between your team and the curator, it could take several months. Or if you submit, really high quality data that doesn't need much human intervention, then that might shorten the timeline. But another factor is just how, frankly, busy that repository is. So, if the repository doesn't have a ton of curators on staff and 20 people submit really large data sets at the same time, that timeline may get pushed out a little bit. So something that I would recommend is when you're getting ready to start preparing to submit your data, and you are submitting to a repository where there's staff that will help you, I would reach out and ask what their expected timeline is, especially if you're trying to meet a timeline of having your data available at the time of publication, or if your period of performance is getting ready to end and you need to have your data published quickly. They may be able to work with you and expedite things, but that's where sort of planning ahead is going to be really helpful.
Yes. And in addition, many of the websites that are, or repositories that are supported by NIH directly are starting to put messages on their site about timelines if there are delays or changes to when your data deposition will be available. So you can also kind of get an idea of that as well when you're looking at initial repositories. And repositories are very good at also providing information during the process. Once you've started the data deposition, they'll kind of keep you in communication with expectations. All right, question number 2. This one is also for Ali. Would you be able to demonstrate the most efficient way to download the pain CDEs?
So there is a HEAL CDE repository that I think I can drop a link in the chat. No, maybe I can't. Okay, maybe that someone can drop the link in the chat. I will give that with a caveat that it was no longer being maintained for a while there were some disruptions in the federal government. We did hear right before the government shutdown that they do plan to start actively maintaining it again, but obviously now during the shutdown, it's not being maintained. So it will eventually be maintained again, but for now that link is where you can find and download common data elements. And I think we also have a Fresh Fair webinar on CDEs that would also probably be really handy for getting more information about HEAL common data elements. And I think we can drop that link in the chat too.
Thank you. All right, question number 3 goes to Keith. What's your recommendation when it comes to derived or computed variables? For example, race classification derived from multiple race indicators or the Charleston comorbidity index. Should these be included in shared data sets?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the answer is that it depends. And I think it's probably something that's worth asking sort of the HEAL stewards on whether it's something that they think it should be included or not. And then I think the other thing is really is there any pre-existing guidance that that might exist on how to go about doing some of these mappings? Because I think it depends on like the value set of a common data element, like for race, for instance, whether there's is it does it allow for sort of multiple values, sort of multiple variables versus, just a single value in the value set that's like a multiple races, right? And so how you handle that might be different depending on those values. And then the same kind of a similar thing with Charleston comorbidity index in terms of what you're mapping it to, whether there's some sort of disease burden common data element, for instance, that it could map to that versus like, are you trying to reverse engineer comorbidities or something from the CCM, right? So that may not be totally appropriate, that sort of latter example. So I think it really is a question of like what you're mapping it to, and then just issues around like potential data loss or sort of are you inadvertently imputing data or something like this. And so I think those are all sort of factors that come into play. And so there's different, I would say there's just different trade-offs, and there may be different decisions. It's almost variable by variable, I think, depending on what you've got in your data.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There was a question about what is the link to the qualitative data repository, and so we will drop that link into the chat, and we'll make sure it's also all of our resources and any links that we discuss in webinars are put in a follow-up email. So we'll make sure that all of our links are there as well so that you can find them. All right, our next question is, how do you enforce existing restrictions on the use of a data set? For example, other research is allowed, but only if cancer related. These limitations should be avoided in consent forms, but they do exist. I guess, Keith, do you want to start with that from your experience, and then Ali, kind of what our recommendations are for?
Yeah. I mean, I think that really kind of the only way you can sort of navigate that is to pick a repository that has sort of a controlled access workflow where you basically have there's a ability to sort of monitor the requests that are coming in and sort of understand the usage and things like that, and then sort of allow access. Certainly if there's restrictions that it can only be used for cancer related research, and if you put it in a public access repository, right, you can't maintain that, and you can't sort of adhere to the spirit of the form. So I'm sure Ali has other things to add, but that's the short version.
Yeah, I mean, I second what Keith said. That's really the only way. So some repositories, thinking off the top of my head, like Bivly and ICPSR can work with you to create a data use agreement. So anyone who's requesting access to that data will have to sign whatever is specified in the data use agreement before they can get access. And so that would be the way, is by picking a repository that can work with you to set up those restrictions.
Thank you. All right. Our next question is for Ali. What can teams do in year 1 to make data deposition easier in year 5?
That's a great question. So I talked a little bit about this in my slides, but I think the number one thing is ensuring that your data management and sharing plan meets the different HEAL and NIH requirements, and that will really help. Having a good understanding of that and planning to meet those requirements will really help in the long run. Registering on the HEAL platform, completing your CEDAR/study level metadata form, and sharing the repository that you intend to use with either the stewards or the platform are 3 steps that you can take within the first year. They don't directly impact like how easy it's going to be to share data at the end, but they are 3 things that you can knock out, and then that way, if something happens and you're sort of rushing to finish your study or share data, those are just 3 fewer things that are on your plate because you'll have done them already. And if anyone is confused by those steps that I just listed, the checklist resource that was shared in the chat during my presentation lists out those steps and how to complete them. So those are 3 really easy and quick, maybe I shouldn't say really easy, but they're relatively quick steps that you can knock out early on. And then the last thing is just reiterating from what I said in my slides is not only just selecting a repository, but really understanding the requirements of that repository when it comes to, data file requirements, size restrictions, format requirements, so that when you're preparing your data and getting ready to share, you're not met with any surprises that like, oh, they can't even take this size, or like they're not allowing me to submit this file type, and half my files are in that format. So just understanding what is required of you for that specific repository will really help too.
Thank you. All right, our next question, we'll start with Keith. How does your team build data sharing into day-to-day workflows rather than treating it as a one-time end of study task?
Yeah, and I mean, I think this sort of builds on what Ali was saying at the end of her comment in particular. I mean, sort of certainly having the repository sort of picked out early and then understanding what some of the requirements are, that can kind of propagate through the rest of your study. But like understanding again, like the file types that are required, like the variable naming conventions, I think really it can help you when you're sort of planning your sort of data collection, your case report forms. If there's certain ways that the repository structures information, and there's a way that you can capture it sort of directly as part of your study that would make it easier, like when you're transforming it, right? I mean, it's certainly that process is a lot more straightforward than re-engineering it at the end. There's you also want to do what's sort of best scientifically for your study, and so sometimes you can't avoid that kind of issue. But if there are things where again you can capture it in a way that makes life easier for you when you're creating these files for deposition, that helps. I think some of it is also like if you're trying to make it so that your analytic files can be used along with the data that's submitted, that there's a way that you, again, I sort of mentioned the variable sort of transformations and things. So you could think about a process that sort of allows your analysis to run on the deposited data. I mean, some of that is, I think we're kind of still relatively early in this and sort of everything that needs to happen. And, we'll kind of, we'll continue to learn as we go. But like, I think those are some of the things so that you're not getting to the end of data collection and be like, oh, if I had just done X, Y, and Z, like I would have saved hundreds of hours on the transformation side of things. So I think it's really, it's that sort of process where you're sort of trying to understand the end goal, and then again, if there's anything you can do earlier to make your life easier.
So our next two questions are related to this as well. So what are some common pitfalls that you see when investigators wait till the end to think about sharing data? I don't know, Allie, if you want to start.
Yeah, I feel like I sound like a broken record over here, but I think one of the biggest consequences is limited repository options. So I mean, there are like more than 25 repository options on the HEAL compliant list. But when you wait to the end to sort of think about data sharing, it limits your choices on that list because, whether some of them charge a fee and you didn't budget for a fee. Some of them have, only take specific data types, so that sort of narrows it down even further. Maybe their timeline for when they're able to publish your data does not meet the NIH and HEAL requirements for sharing your data, at the time of publication or at the end of the period of performance, whichever comes first. So it can really limit the repository that you're able to end up using. And it can also limit the amount of support you're able to get. So sort of in a similar vein, data curation support often costs money. And if you didn't budget for that, then you won't be able to get support on that end. And same thing with timeline. Data curation by a professional data curator will take time. And if you're sort of rushing to submit data at the end and rushing to meet these deadlines, you might not have the time available. And then also just the stress that it causes to sort of make these decisions when there's a deadline looming is one of the most common things that we see. So those are some things to think about.
And then on the flip side of that, Keith, like what are some challenges that teams face at the beginning when they're first planning for data sharing, particularly for large, like multi-site projects?
Yeah. And so again, like I do think that some of the HEAL trials in the collaboratory, because they didn't have to have all this fleshed out beforehand, it was a little bit more challenging for them. So it might look a little different for the sort of the studies that are starting now. But like the repository selection, I think was an issue because, as Ali mentioned, there was like 25 or something, but I think, amongst our trials, they were like talking about three, right? So you quickly narrow down to like, because again, the restrictions on the data that they accept and other things. And so that can kind of narrow things down. I think the other thing, we talked about some of the, I guess, more technical sort of issues in terms of like data mapping and things like that. But the other thing is like this is still pretty new for a lot of people on these study teams, and so you may have um, statisticians and data managers and clinicians and just like a lot of people that kind of need to be involved in the process with like varying degrees of understanding of like what's required and like some of the like sausage making, if you will, that goes into this and the decisions that you have to make and why they matter and all of that, right? So I think some of the early challenges has just been like getting everybody just understand like what needs to happen, what does all this mean, how do I given my role in the study team, I have to contribute X, Y, and Z to the process. How do I do that, right? And so I think sort of going through the resources that have been sort of put out there and trying to educate people and everything has been, I think, a critical sort of step that needs to be overcome for studies.
Mhm. All right, Ali, question number 9 is for you. If my study has limited staff or funding, what's the single most impactful step that we can take to set ourselves up for success?
Yeah, so the answer sounds pretty obvious, but it's identifying free and low cost resources to help with data sharing. And so that's something that the HEAL Stewards can help with, because we can help identify repositories that you can utilize for free, or maybe that offer free support. There are also some repositories like ICPSR where they'll offer, or like NADAP, which is a part of ICPSR, that'll offer fee waivers that you can apply for, to help get support, still putting out high quality curated data, but they can help with addressing the cost. And then I think a lot of people also either underestimate or are unaware of the free resources that your institution can provide. So pretty much anyone who has an award that's affiliated with an institution, the library at your institution often offers really awesome support, whether that is like they can curate your data, even though you're not submitting to their institutional instance of their library. Data curators can often help with data curation. Your institutions are often affiliated with a lot of the repositories that are on the list, where you can get, some level of free support or free storage space from the repository itself via that institutional affiliation. So yeah, really looking at the internal free support that can be provided. And that's another thing that HEAL Stewards can help out with. A lot of times when we're meeting with people, we go to their libraries page and look at what's offered, but also just reaching out internally to your contacts at the institution should be able to get you to the right place as well.
Absolutely. All right. Our next question asks, which repositories best support access to individual level clinical trial data with EHR linkage or supplementation? I can repeat that question if you need me to.
Yeah, if you could repeat it, that would be great.
Sure. So which repositories best support access to individual level clinical trial data with EHR linkage or supplementation?
Okay, that's a good question. So the repository that comes to mind when anyone says clinical trial data, the first repository is called Vivly, and maybe somebody can drop a link to Vivly in the chat. But Vivly is a dedicated clinical trial repository specifically, and they're sort of also a generalist repository in that they accept, any type of file type or format. And that's one of the repositories that I mentioned earlier today because they can help work with you to set up the appropriate DUA, because everyone who is requesting any data from Vivly has to sign a data use agreement. So Vivly is one of the first ones that I think of. There are several other repositories on the HEAL compliant list that can support clinical trial data, ICPSR being one of them. NIMH Data Archive is another. But if you have questions specifically for, wanting to weigh the pros and cons between those repositories, you can absolutely reach out to us and we can meet with you individually to talk about your study and give more specific detailed recommendations. And you can also reach out to the repositories themselves. Most of the repositories on our list, we've had really good experience with them, with researchers reaching out and then replying relatively quickly. So there's a couple options for you to get more information on that.
And Dr. Marsolo, being that you're with the head of the EHR core, like what are things that you encounter when to share, when not to share EHR or clinical level data or support documentation?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's a good question, and some of it depends on, I mean, certainly whether there's restrictions imposed by the data use agreements or the the consent forms, because this can come up. I mean, obviously the consent forms are their own thing, but like even the data use agreements where you're going with a private company that, provides health services, and you're linking to that source to do your analysis. And so you may only be able to share sort of a fraction of the data, or, just certain aspects of it. And so some of that comes into play. And then I think the other sort of issues that can come up are around, if any of the variables are become identifying, and you might need to do like some suppression or generalizing, or something like that, where you're converting the sort of actual, sort of values that you might have used analytically, but you can't share it for, sort of under de-identification sort of restrictions. So that's part of it. And then I think the other thing is again with the CDEs, if there's just things in the definitions of the CDEs that would cause you to transform the data one way or the other, and then you might have to leave something out. Again, it's not it's just one of those factors where, because of how it's defined, it just doesn't make it in the definition, and so it doesn't go there. So I think those are a few of the sort of decision points that folks have to make.
Mhm. Yeah, I would definitely also emphasize the DUA with the entity that hosts or owns the EHR data will be one of the points that determine how much data can be shared. And so navigating that at the beginning of the project will definitely help it set you up for data deposition and data curation. We've had teams realize they can't share data, or that certain data, more data needs to be masked than expected later on in the project. So understanding what data sharing is allowed from all of the sources of data that you are collecting is also extremely important in figuring out what can be shared, and then that will help identify resources and repositories where that's possible. All right. Question 11 is a bit specific. And so I'll see if there's ideas on this, and if not, we are more than happy to have a conversation outside of this webinar about this topic. So what should researchers do when time and location are essential to their data? For example, in the ecological momentary assessments or activity tracking, removing that information for de-identification could eliminate much of the meaningful information. So I think whoever asked this, is the question more like, if you have identifying information that's essential for analysis and essential for understanding the research aims, how do you handle that with the de-identification process, or are you asking a different type of question?
I think I can maybe start talking in the meantime if someone wants to specify their question. But I think part of it is going to depend on the requirements of your repository. So if they require a certain like HIPAA safe harbor method versus like anonymization versus what level of de-identification that they require and will accept. So once again, repository selection would be a really important choice there. Another thing to consider is maybe using RUCA codes for de-identifying location information, or and also like aggregating data on location is something that we recommended in some cases, and date. So it's kind of going to be dependent on a couple of different factors, but I don't know if Keith, you have anything to add, or if
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it really kind of depends on the study and the repository, and just like the requirements that you're having to navigate. This is one of those where, again, there's there may not be a great answer, or it's just trying to do what's the best you can, right? Because what you've collected, or the information that you have for your analysis, it's just not something that can be shared in its current state. And so you're either dropping variables or you're obfuscating or something along those lines. And I think where you go down that path is just going to be dependent on a number of factors.
Thank you.
And I saw the additional note there about what to do with information collected but not shared. So yeah, and you're right that you're only required to share data underlying a publication. And of course we encourage sharing enough data for like reproducibility, but if the question is what to do with the data that you don't share, a lot of times your data use agreement or institution will have a recommendation for data that you're not required to share, which sometimes includes like destroying those data. So if that is more so the question of what to do with the data that you don't share, then sort of seeing the requirements of your study, whether that's with the DUA or any institutional requirements or requirements outlined by your IRB, is what you would refer to for that.
Okay, thank you. So we want to thank all of our presenters today. The HEAL Stewards and the HEAL Data Platform team have a variety of resources that are available. And I'm going to hopefully show them on the screen. If not, we will make sure that they are included in the follow-up email. In addition to our presenters and panelists, there are quite a few people who help us behind the scene and who work diligently to bring this webinar to production, and we want to thank them as well as thank you for your participation today. In addition to the recording for this webinar, we will also be emailing everyone who is registered a list of resources. So this slide deck will be shared with a list to our of our panel and of our resources, which I believe, okay, hopefully we will see soon on the screen. Our webinar for next month will also be held on Thursday, November 20th at 1 p.m. and it is focusing on reusing data, where we are going to focus on how combining HEAL data sets promote data reuse and accelerate discovery, often made possible through metadata gathered via the HEAL data ecosystem, tools, and the collaborative support of the HEAL platform, HEAL Stewards, and the HEAL CDE team. We've seen several other questions come in since our Q&A stopped, and we will do our best to include information in our follow-up email about specifically around ultrasound files, and there's some other questions around scientific data that needs to be shared. But at this time, we are going to end the webinar, and we thank you all for attending and hope you have a wonderful day.